What if the oldest written civilization on Earth did not end in collapse, conquest or decay, but in silence? Not the silence of ruins abandoned to time, but the silence of something deliberately stepping away. No final war, no great fire, no dramatic fall recorded in legend, just a moment when the gods stopped answering. Before we go any further, take a moment to notice where you are right now, the hour, the stillness around you. History, especially ancient history, was not meant to be rushed. It was remembered in the quiet, passed from voice to voice, long before it was ever written down. If you're listening from far away or late into the night, you're exactly where this story was always meant to be heard. If these deep explorations into forgotten history matter to you, staying with the channel, whether by subscribing or simply returning, helps keep these stories alive. Now let's begin. In the late 19th century, archaeologists digging through the ruins of Nippur uncovered thousands of clay tablets buried beneath layers of collapsed temples and windblown earth. At first glance, most of them appeared ordinary. Administrative records, grain tallies, temple inventories, contracts between merchants. The paperwork of a civilization that prized order, measurement and record keeping. But hidden among these fragments were texts that did not belong to commerce or bureaucracy. Their language was different, their tone was restrained, and their subject matter was unsettling. They did not describe creation. They did not celebrate divine power. They did not threaten punishment or promise blessing. Instead, they described absence. In Sumerian literature, the gods were not distant abstractions. They were present. They resided in temples. They received offerings. They issued instructions through priests, dreams, and rituals. The divine and human worlds were interwoven so tightly that separating them would have been unthinkable. And then, according to several late Sumerian texts, something changed. Temple records show that ritual activity ceased abruptly around the early 2nd millennium BCE, not gradually, not unevenly, but almost simultaneously across multiple major cities. Offering tables were left in place. Sacred vessels were abandoned where they had been used. Maintenance stopped. Renovations were left unfinished. At Eridu, long considered the oldest city in Mesopotamian tradition, the main temple complex shows evidence of careful closure rather than destruction. Objects were arranged deliberately. Inner chambers were sealed. The sacred space was preserved, not erased. At Uruk, the great temple precinct dedicated to the sky deity experienced a similar fate. Drainage systems were closed. Access corridors were blocked with precision. There are no signs of invasion, fire, or looting. The city itself continued. The gods, however, no longer lived there. Archaeologists noticed this pattern early on, but struggled to explain it. Civilizations usually collapse loudly. They leave scars, burn layers, weapons, mass graves. This was different. It looked less like abandonment and more like a withdrawal. The texts themselves reinforce this impression. Late Sumerian compositions, written in a matter-of-fact tone, speak of divine beings completing their appointed roles. The language resembles administrative reporting more than myth. Phrases appear that translate roughly as "the task was finished" or "the time was fulfilled." These are not the words of catastrophe. They are the words of conclusion. What makes this even more striking is the absence of replacement. In later Mesopotamian cultures, gods still existed, but they were no longer present in the same way. The relationship changed. Where Sumerian texts describe direct interaction, later Akkadian and Babylonian texts rely heavily on intermediaries, omens, symbolic dreams, celestial signs that required interpretation. The gods were still there, but no longer accessible. Something fundamental had shifted. The famous Sumerian king list offers a clue, though it is often misunderstood. The earliest portions describe rulers whose reigns lasted impossibly long spans of time, thousands of years. Scholars rightly interpret these as symbolic, not literal, but the transition point in the list is revealing. After a certain moment, kingship is described as having descended from heaven once and never again. After that point, rulers are human, fully human. Mortality returns to the timeline. This is not presented as a tragedy. It is presented as a change in status. The gods had stepped back. One of the most intriguing aspects of this transition is how little drama surrounds it. There is no epic farewell recorded in surviving texts, no lamentation for the gods' departure. Instead, later literature seems to accept the separation as inevitable, even necessary. This raises a question historians rarely ask directly. Why would a culture so deeply dependent on divine presence record its loss so quietly? One possible answer is that it was expected. Sumerian cosmology is intensely structured. Time is cyclical, authority is delegated, roles are assigned and fulfilled. In this world view, permanence is not assumed. Even the gods operate within cosmic limits. Several creation texts hint at this structure. They describe a world ordered through labour, division of responsibility, and balance. Once that balance is achieved, active intervention becomes unnecessary. Guidance gives way to observation. Importantly, none of this requires believing that the gods were physical beings in the modern sense. What matters is how the Sumerians understood their relationship with the divine. For them, the gods were organisers, regulators and teachers. They brought law, measurement, agriculture, writing and city planning into the world. Once those systems were established, humanity was expected to maintain them. This interpretation aligns with what we see archaeologically. After the period of divine withdrawal, human institutions grow stronger, not weaker. Legal codes appear. Writing expands beyond temple use. Trade networks widen. Human authority consolidates. In other words, humanity does not collapse when the gods withdraw. It adapts. And yet, something is undeniably lost. Later Mesopotamian cultures are haunted by memory. They look backward constantly, referencing an earlier age when order was purer, knowledge more complete, justice more direct. This is not nostalgia for a golden age of wealth, but for an age of clarity. The gods no longer speak plainly. Priests now interpret signs. Astronomers watch the sky for meaning. Kings rule without direct confirmation. Humanity has been left alone. This is where the story becomes unsettling, not because it implies alien intervention or lost technology, but because it mirrors something deeply human, the moment when guidance ends, the moment when responsibility transfers fully to the learner. The Sumerians did not record the gods leaving in anger. They recorded them leaving because the work was done. And that may be the most disturbing idea of all. Because if the earliest civilization believed the gods withdrew once humanity was ready to continue on its own, then the question is no longer, did the gods leave? The question becomes, what were they preparing humanity for? And why did later civilizations seem so uncertain that the preparation was enough? In the next segment, we'll follow the silence itself, examining how later Mesopotamian cultures tried to re-establish contact, what replaced direct divine presence, and why the sky became the final language between gods and humans. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, like a door closing somewhere deep inside a vast building. The rituals continued for a time. The prayers were still spoken. The stars were still watched. But something essential had shifted. The answers no longer came directly. For the Sumerians, this absence was not abstract. It was felt in the daily mechanics of civilization. Temples, once places of interaction, became places of interpretation. Priests no longer conveyed messages from gods who walked among them. Instead, they studied signs, smoke patterns, oil floating on water, the flight of birds, the arrangement of stars. Meaning was no longer spoken, it had to be decoded. This transformation marks one of the most profound changes in human history, the transition from presence to symbol. In earlier periods, divine authority was immediate. A god's will was known because it was delivered directly. In the later Mesopotamian world, divine will became something inferred. This required a new class of specialists, diviners, astronomers, omen readers, people trained not to hear gods, but to read the universe itself. And the universe, unlike a speaking god, is silent unless you know how to listen. The rise of celestial observation during this period is not coincidental. As the gods withdrew from the ground, they seemed to retreat into the sky. Mesopotamian texts from the Akkadian and early Babylonian periods show a dramatic increase in astronomical recording. Movements of planets were logged obsessively. Lunar cycles were charted with precision. Eclipses were feared, not because they were rare, but because they were interpreted as messages from distant powers, no longer physically present. This was not superstition. It was adaptation. If the gods no longer walked among humans, then their language had to be found elsewhere. The sky became the last remaining interface. What's remarkable is how quickly humanity rose to this challenge. Babylonian astronomers developed mathematical systems capable of predicting planetary motion centuries before similar techniques appeared elsewhere. These calculations were not performed for curiosity alone. They were acts of communication. Each alignment, each anomaly, was treated as intentional, something meant to be seen. But beneath this effort lies a deeper anxiety. Many texts from this era express uncertainty about whether the gods would ever return. Prayers ask not for miracles, but for signs of attention. Kings boast not of divine companionship, but of divine approval. An important distinction. Approval can be withdrawn, presence cannot. This anxiety is especially visible in the shift of temple architecture. Earlier temples were designed as residences, places where gods lived. Later, temples become more symbolic, more abstract, more monumental. They point upward. Ziggurats rise like artificial mountains, bridging earth and sky. They are not houses, they are beacons. From their summits, priests watched the heavens night after night, generation after generation. They recorded patterns with obsessive care, believing that if the gods had departed, they had done so along fixed paths, paths that could be traced, paths that might one day open again. This belief is preserved in later astronomical texts that divide the sky into structured regions, each associated with specific divine authorities. These divisions are not poetic, they are systematic. The heavens are mapped as territory, organised, predictable, governed by rules. In effect, humanity rebuilt the gods' order in the sky after losing it on earth. But this reconstruction came at a cost. Without direct guidance, interpretation became power. Those who could read the signs held influence. Knowledge became guarded. Texts became restricted. Temples became archives, storing not just grain and silver, but information, astronomical records, ritual protocols, ancient formulas whose origins were no longer fully understood. This is where memory begins to fracture. Later, scribes copy older texts faithfully, even when they no longer understand their meaning. Instructions are preserved long after their purpose is forgotten. Rituals are performed because they are inherited, not because their original function remains clear. This is how civilizations preserve fragments of lost knowledge without realizing it. The Sumerians themselves seem to have anticipated this. Several late texts warn that future generations will misunderstand what they inherit. They speak of names without bodies and paths without travellers. The language is cryptic, but the implication is clear. Systems would remain after their creators had gone. And so humanity learned to live in a world shaped by absent architects. This pattern of inheritance without explanation appears again and again throughout history. Technologies whose origins are unclear, laws whose rationale is forgotten, sacred sites whose builders are unknown even to those who worship there. The withdrawal of the gods did not end civilization. It changed its trajectory. Humanity became self-governing, but also self-doubting. The sky remained silent and vast, offering patterns but no instructions. And for the first time, humans had to decide what those patterns meant on their own. In the next segment, we will examine how this silence shaped later religious systems, why intermediaries replaced direct contact, and how the memory of divine presence slowly transformed into myth, legend, and eventually denial. Once the gods no longer spoke plainly, humanity did what it has always done in the face of uncertainty. It built systems to compensate. The disappearance of direct divine presence did not create a spiritual vacuum. It created an administrative one. In the centuries following what Sumerian texts describe as the withdrawal, we see the slow emergence of intermediaries, figures who did not claim to be gods themselves, but who claimed access to the gods' intentions: kings, priests, scribes, diviners. The language of authority changed. Power was no longer justified by proximity to divine beings, but by interpretation of divine signs. This is where religion, as we recognize it today, truly begins. Earlier Sumerian belief was not faith-based in the modern sense. It was experiential. The gods were present. They acted. They issued commands. Belief was unnecessary when observation was possible. After the withdrawal, belief became essential. Texts from the old Babylonian period reflect this shift with remarkable clarity. Gods are no longer described as walking the streets of cities or physically entering temples. Instead, they appear in dreams, in omens, in symbolic visions that require explanation. The divine realm becomes distant, elevated, abstract. This distance changes everything. When divine instruction must be interpreted, interpretation becomes contested. Different priests read the same signs differently. Different cities emphasize different gods. Theology fragments. This fragmentation is not accidental. It is structural. Without centralized divine authority, local traditions evolve independently. Over time, these traditions harden into distinct religious systems, each claiming continuity with the past, even as their practices diverge. And yet, buried within these emerging religions are traces of something older. The earliest intermediary figures, the Apkallu, the sages, the semi-divine instructors, occupy a strange space in Mesopotamian tradition. They are not gods, but they are not fully human either. They are described as teachers sent by the gods in earlier ages, bearers of knowledge who helped establish civilization. Later traditions reinterpret them as mythological, but earlier texts treat them as historical. These figures are said to have taught writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, astronomy, not gradually, but suddenly. Fully formed systems appear in the archaeological record with no clear developmental trail. This abrupt appearance has long troubled historians. Civilizations do not typically invent multiple complex systems simultaneously. Writing, standardized law, advanced mathematics, and monumental architecture usually evolve over centuries. In Sumer, they appear within generations. The standard explanation attributes this to rapid cultural innovation, but this explanation struggles to account for the precision and completeness of these systems at their inception. The alternative interpretation, preserved quietly in later texts, is that this knowledge was inherited, not invented. The Apkallu are described as mediators between ages. They bridge a time when the gods were present and a time when they were not. Their role was to stabilize human civilization after divine withdrawal by transferring essential knowledge in durable forms. This idea reframes early civilization not as a beginning, but as a salvage operation. Knowledge that once flowed directly now had to be stored, taught, ritualized. Writing becomes crucial not because humans suddenly became literate, but because memory could no longer rely on living sources, and writing itself carries signs of this urgency. The earliest cuneiform tablets are not poetic, they are administrative, lists, inventories, measurements, schedules. They read like emergency manuals for running a complex system without its original operators. Even religious texts from this period resemble procedural documents. Ritual instructions are precise, offerings are quantified, timing is exact. Deviations are warned against. This is not worship driven by faith, it is maintenance driven by fear of failure, fear of losing contact entirely. As centuries pass, the memory of direct divine presence fades further. Stories become allegorical, gods become anthropomorphized. Conflicts between divine beings replace administrative records of councils and decisions. Mythology blooms where history grows dim. But certain anomalies persist. One of the most striking is the persistent belief in return. Across Mesopotamian traditions, there is no concept of permanent abandonment. The gods withdraw, but they do not die. They depart, but they leave paths behind. The heavens are mapped not just as symbols, but as roots. This expectation of return fundamentally shapes later religious thought. It introduces the idea of cycles rather than conclusions. Ages end, but they also begin again. Decline is temporary, renewal is possible. This worldview is not linear, it is recursive, and it produces a very specific psychological effect: vigilance. Humanity becomes a waiting civilization. Ritual calendars are designed not only to honour the past, but to signal readiness. Temples are maintained long after their purpose becomes obscure. Astronomical observations continue even when their original meaning is forgotten. Why maintain systems you no longer fully understand? Because someone once told you they mattered. This is how legacy persists beyond comprehension. As direct contact faded, authority shifted further into human hands. Kings began to claim divine mandate rather than divine companionship. Law codes invoked gods as witnesses, not authors. This subtle shift marks the birth of human sovereignty. But it is a fragile sovereignty. Without gods present to enforce cosmic order, humans must enforce it themselves. This produces law, punishment, hierarchy. Power consolidates. Violence increases. Ironically, the withdrawal of divine control may have accelerated both human independence and human conflict. Texts from the late Sumerian and early Akkadian periods show growing concern over chaos, injustice, and disorder. Laments describe cities abandoned not by gods, but by morality. Kings plead for guidance, not because they lack power, but because they fear misusing it. The gods become moral ideals rather than operational overseers. This transformation sets the stage for everything that follows in human history. Religion becomes symbolic. Knowledge becomes institutional. Memory becomes myth. Yet beneath these layers, the original record remains, fragmented, obscured, but not erased. Tablets are copied again and again, preserving archaic phrases whose meaning is no longer clear. Rituals are repeated without understanding their function. Sacred objects are guarded even when their purpose is forgotten. Humanity carries forward a cargo it does not fully recognize. And this raises a troubling question. If civilization as we know it emerged not from ignorance, but from loss, if it represents a diminished version of something more direct, more integrated, then what does progress really mean? Are we advancing towards something new? Or are we circling around something old, trying to reconstruct what was once given freely? In the next segment, we will follow this question beyond Mesopotamia, tracing how the memory of withdrawal echoes across cultures, how similar patterns appear in Egypt, the Indus Valley, and beyond, and why so many civilizations share the same unsettling story, that humanity was once guided, then left to stand alone. When the memory of direct guidance fades in one civilization, it might be dismissed as local mythology. When it fades in many, across vast distances and unrelated cultures, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a pattern. As Mesopotamia moved into its post-withdrawal age, similar transitions were unfolding far beyond its borders, often without contact, trade, or shared language. And yet, the same structural shift appears again and again. A time of instruction, a moment of separation, then centuries spent preserving fragments of a lost order. In Egypt, the earliest religious texts do not describe gods as distant abstractions. They describe them as rulers, administrators, engineers of cosmic order. Osiris, Thoth, Ptah. These are not initially metaphors. They are civilizing figures who establish agriculture, law, writing, and measurement. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious inscriptions in the world, preserve echoes of this transition. They speak of a primeval age when divine beings ruled directly on earth, followed by a moment of ascent. The gods rise into the sky. The pharaoh remains behind as intermediary. This mirrors Mesopotamia almost exactly. The pharaoh is not worshipped because he is divine. He is worshipped because he maintains Ma'at, cosmic order, after the gods depart. His authority derives from preservation, not creation. Even Egyptian architecture reflects this inheritance model. The earliest monumental stone structures appear suddenly. They do not begin as crude experiments. They emerge with advanced geometry, precise alignments, and standardized construction techniques. The Great Pyramid does not represent the start of pyramid building. It represents the peak. Later pyramids decline in quality, accuracy, and ambition. This inversion, where the oldest structures are the most sophisticated, repeats across the ancient world. It challenges the idea of gradual technological evolution. Egyptian texts quietly acknowledge this. Later priests speak of the first time, Zep-Tepi, when the gods ruled and taught humanity. Everything after is framed as restoration, not innovation. Rituals are reenactments. Temples are replicas. Knowledge is remembered, not discovered. The same structure appears in the Indus Valley. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro emerge with advanced urban planning, standardized bricks, complex drainage systems, and precise weights and measures. There is no archaeological trail showing gradual development toward this level of sophistication. And just as mysteriously, the civilization declines without signs of invasion or collapse. No widespread destruction, no mass graves, just abandonment. Later Indian traditions preserve the memory differently. In the Vedic texts, gods arrive, establish order, then withdraw. The Yuga system describes cyclical ages of decline, each one further removed from divine proximity. Humanity moves from Satya Yuga, an age of truth and direct connection, to Kali Yuga, the age of separation. This is not a linear fall from grace. It is a designed cycle. The gods are not defeated, they leave. China preserves the pattern through culture heroes rather than gods. Figures like Fuxi, Nuwa, and the Yellow Emperor teach writing, agriculture, medicine, and astronomy. They appear suddenly, establish civilization, then vanish. Later rulers attempt to preserve their teachings through ritual and bureaucracy. Chinese tradition explicitly states that these figures came from heaven and returned to it. In Mesoamerica, the pattern repeats again. The Olmec civilization appears with advanced stonework, symbolic writing, and cosmological knowledge that later cultures inherit but cannot fully replicate. The Maya speak of creator gods who fashioned humanity, taught them, then withdrew after humans saw too much. The Popol Vuh describes multiple failed creations of humanity before the gods succeed, then distance themselves to prevent humans from becoming too knowledgeable. This is not fear of rebellion, it is fear of dependency. Across continents, the same narrative structure emerges. A time of presence, a time of instruction, a deliberate withdrawal, a mandate to preserve knowledge, a warning against premature return. These similarities are too precise to dismiss as coincidence, especially when they are accompanied by the same material evidence, advanced calendars, astronomical alignments, sudden architectural sophistication, then stagnation, decline, reinterpretation, and everywhere rituals designed not to summon gods, but to signal readiness. This distinction is critical. Most ancient rituals are not prayers in the modern sense. They are protocols, timing matters, measurements matter, precision matters. These are not emotional appeals. They are technical operations. If the gods were merely symbolic, such precision would be unnecessary. But if contact once depended on specific conditions, astronomical, environmental, or otherwise, then ritual becomes maintenance. This reframes the role of the priesthood entirely. Priests are not spiritual guides. They are system operators. They preserve procedures long after understanding fades. They copy texts they no longer fully comprehend. They guard spaces whose function has been forgotten. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of ancient religion: obsessive repetition. Why perform the same ceremony unchanged for thousands of years? Because deviation risks failure. Failure of what? Contact, communication, continuity. As generations pass, the original purpose of these systems becomes obscured. Symbol replaces function. Myth replaces record. Gods become personalities rather than administrators. But certain elements persist stubbornly: sacred geometry, astronomical timing, restricted knowledge, initiation systems, hereditary priesthoods. These are not spiritual innovations, they are control mechanisms. They ensure knowledge does not diffuse too widely. They protect systems from misuse. They slow decay, and decay is inevitable. The longer humanity operates without direct guidance, the more interpretation drifts. Knowledge fragments. Techniques are lost. Symbols multiply. By the time classical civilizations arise, Greece, Rome, Persia, the original narrative has splintered beyond recognition. Yet even here the echoes remain. Plato writes of Atlantis, a technologically advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophe. He frames it as history, not allegory. He claims it comes from Egyptian records. Greek myths speak of gods withdrawing to Olympus, no longer walking among humans. Prometheus gives fire, knowledge, then suffers punishment. Roman religion is almost entirely inherited, its rituals preserved without understanding their origin. And everywhere the same unease appears. Humanity senses it is alone. Not abandoned exactly, but unsupervised. This produces a dual impulse. One impulse is hubris. If the gods are gone, humans must become gods themselves. Empire, conquest, domination. The other is longing, the hope of return, the expectation that guidance will resume. Both impulses shape history. Empires rise attempting to recreate divine order through force. Religions evolve promising salvation through obedience. Philosophies emerge grappling with the absence of absolute authority. Yet beneath all of it, the older memory waits. The memory that humanity once stood closer to something greater, and that distance was imposed, not earned. This leads us to a critical turning point. If withdrawal was intentional, then it served a purpose. And if it served a purpose, then humanity's current state must be evaluated against that purpose. Were we meant to grow beyond guidance? Or were we meant to prove we could survive without it? The answer determines how we interpret everything that follows. In the next segment, we will examine the physical remnants that defy symbolic interpretation entirely, the anomalous artifacts, engineering impossibilities, and out-of-place technologies that suggest not just instruction, but infrastructure, not metaphors, not myths, but machines. If the withdrawal of direct guidance was only a cultural memory, we would expect its traces to exist mainly in stories, rituals, and symbolic language. But that is not what the record shows. Scattered across the world are physical objects that do not behave like symbols at all. They behave like tools, devices, components of systems that were designed to function, not to inspire belief. These objects are rare, fragmented, often discovered accidentally, and almost always controversial. They are what researchers cautiously refer to as anomalous artifacts. The problem with these artifacts is not that they are mysterious. History is full of mysteries. The problem is that they are inconvenient. They do not fit anywhere in the accepted timeline, and there is no comfortable category in which to place them. Take the objects found embedded in ancient geological strata. Coal seams, for example, form over tens of millions of years. The pressure, heat, and time required to create coal make contamination from modern objects extraordinarily unlikely, and yet multiple 19th and early 20th century mining reports describe metallic objects recovered from coal seams that predate human industry by orders of magnitude. One such object, documented in an 1885 report from Austria, was a small iron cube with sharply defined right angles and smooth faces. It was extracted from a coal seam dated to the Miocene epoch. No known geological process produces perfect cubes. No known natural mechanism creates flat metallic planes at right angles. The object was quietly removed from public view. In Illinois, miners reported discovering a gold chain embedded within a coal block dated to over 250 million years old. The chain's links were uniform, symmetrical, and clearly manufactured. It was briefly examined, reported in a local newspaper, and then vanished. These are not isolated accounts. Brass vessels encased within solid rock, nails found inside sandstone, tools sealed within limestone. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Objects with unmistakable signs of manufacture found where manufacture should not exist. Mainstream explanations tend to follow three routes. The first is contamination, the idea that modern objects somehow fell into ancient layers. This explanation works occasionally, but fails when the surrounding matrix is undisturbed and clearly ancient. The second is misidentification, that the objects are natural formations mistaken for tools. This fails when metallurgical analysis reveals refined alloys, worked surfaces, or machining marks. The third is hoax. This is often invoked when no other explanation suffices. Yet hoaxes require motive, opportunity, and consistency. Many of these discoveries were made by miners with no incentive to fabricate evidence, documented by professionals, and forgotten before they could generate attention. Hoaxes seek recognition. these artifacts disappear. More unsettling are objects that suggest not just craftsmanship, but advanced understanding of materials. Consider the so-called London hammer, found embedded in limestone in Texas. Its wooden handle has partially fossilized. Its iron head shows purity and alloying inconsistent with 19th century metallurgy. The surrounding stone dates to over 100 million years old. Whether one accepts the dating or not, the hammer raises an unavoidable question. Why does it exist at all? Then there are the artifacts resembling electrical components. In the 1930s, archaeologists in Iraq uncovered what became known as the Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod sealed with asphalt. When filled with an acidic solution, it produces a measurable electrical current. There is no definitive evidence it was used as a battery, but there is no definitive evidence it was not, and its design is functionally identical to a galvanic cell. Electrical knowledge should not exist in this context, yet the device exists. Further east, in India, texts describe weapons that sound eerily like energy-based devices. While poetic exaggeration must be considered, certain descriptions are remarkably technical, referencing effects consistent with radiation exposure, heat without flame, and lingering contamination. Again, these accounts are not proof, but they are signals. When physical artifacts, textual descriptions, and architectural anomalies align, dismissal becomes less comfortable. Now consider machining. In ancient Egypt, drill holes in granite show spiral striations that indicate rotational speeds far exceeding what hand tools can produce. Core samples removed from hard stone exhibit feed rates that would require either advanced mechanical systems or unknown methods of material manipulation. In South America, stone blocks weighing over 100 tons are cut with precision, so exact that even modern machining struggles to replicate it. The stones are fitted without mortar, yet their joints are so tight that paper cannot pass between them. The surfaces are not rough, they are smooth, flat, and sometimes polished. These are not aesthetic choices, they are engineering outcomes. If such techniques were achieved once and then lost, it would explain why later cultures could not replicate them, only imitate them poorly. This suggests that certain civilizations inherited ruins rather than built them from scratch. They repaired, reused, and reinterpreted structures whose original function they did not fully understand. Which brings us to the most troubling category of anomalies, those that appear technological in purpose. In multiple ancient sites, archaeologists have found objects whose function cannot be determined by ritual explanation. These include precisely shaped stone rings, metallic discs with etched patterns, crystalline objects with unusual optical properties, and devices composed of multiple materials arranged in deliberate configurations. Some are dismissed as ceremonial, but ceremony does not require tolerances. Ceremony does not require alignment to fractions of a degree. Ceremony does not require materials selected for conductivity, resonance, or durability. Function does. One particularly strange class of artifacts involves crystalline structures. Quartz crystals are found in ancient sites across the world, often shaped, polished, and placed in specific arrangements. Quartz has piezoelectric properties. It generates electrical charge under pressure and vibrates at stable frequencies. Modern technology uses quartz for timekeeping, signal processing, and frequency control. Ancient cultures did not know this, according to conventional history, yet they used quartz extensively, sometimes embedding it within stone structures, aligning it with fault lines or water channels as if exploiting properties they understood but did not name. In Central America, certain temples produce acoustic effects so precise that a clap at the base generates bird-like chirps at the top. These are not accidents of architecture. They require intentional design and knowledge of sound propagation. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe presents perhaps the most confounding case of all. Massive stone pillars carved with intricate symbols were erected over 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, according to accepted timelines. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation, no houses, no trash pits, no burials. It appears to be a dedicated installation, and then, inexplicably, it was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, buried, as if someone wanted it preserved but inaccessible. Why would a society capable of erecting such structures choose to erase them, unless their function was no longer safe, or no longer permitted? This pattern repeats. Advanced sites appear. Function fades. Burial follows. Preservation without access. Which leads us back to the withdrawal. If direct oversight ended and humanity was left with systems it could misuse or misunderstand, then sealing those systems becomes rational. Better to hide than to destroy. Better to preserve than to risk catastrophe. The idea that ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology is often framed as fringe speculation. But the evidence does not require global high-tech societies. It requires localized, specialized knowledge. Knowledge held by a small group. Knowledge transferred selectively. Knowledge withdrawn deliberately. This aligns with everything we have seen so far. The Anunnaki texts do not describe humanity as equals. They describe humanity as workers, caretakers, learners. Technology, in this model, is not widespread. It is controlled. When withdrawal occurs, that control vanishes. What remains is memory, ritual, and fragments of machinery that slowly degrade into mystery, and humanity, lacking understanding, mythologizes what it cannot replicate. A machine becomes a relic. A process becomes a prayer. A system becomes a god, which raises a question that cannot be ignored. If ancient technology existed, and if it was deliberately removed or hidden, what was it capable of? And more importantly, what was it designed to do? In the next segment, we will examine the environments these anomalies cluster around: fault lines, magnetic intersections, ancient waterways, and explore whether these technologies interacted not just with human societies, but with the planet itself. When investigators began plotting the locations of these anomalous sites on maps instead of timelines, something unexpected emerged. They were not random. Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, Giza, Teotihuacan, Pumapunku, Angkor Wat, Baalbek, Easter Island, Nabta Playa, the Great Zimbabwe Complex, the Nazca region, Mohenjo-Daro, separated by oceans, built by cultures with no known contact, yet they share striking geographical similarities. They sit on fault lines. They cluster near underground water systems. They align with zones of unusual electromagnetic activity. They occupy intersections of what modern geophysics calls telluric currents, natural flows of energy through the Earth's crust. Ancient people did not have magnetometers. They did not have satellite mapping. And yet they placed their most complex, precise and resource-intensive structures exactly where the planet itself is most active. This is not coincidence, it is selection. In the 20th century, researchers measuring Earth's natural resonant frequencies discovered something called the Schumann resonance, a standing electromagnetic wave that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Its primary frequency hovers around 7.83 Hz. Human brainwaves in deep meditative and hypnagogic states operate in the same range. This is not mysticism, it is measurable. Now consider ancient structures that amplify sound, channel water, concentrate pressure, and utilize crystalline materials, often quartz-rich stone, placed directly above energetic zones. These structures were not merely temples, they were interfaces. Stonehenge, for example, is not just aligned to solstices. Subsurface surveys reveal it sits atop a complex of underground features, including chalk shafts and natural cavities that enhance acoustic resonance. When reconstructed digitally, the circle behaves like a low-frequency resonator. The stones vibrate. Giza's Great Pyramid is even more extreme. It is built on a limestone plateau saturated with quartz. The pyramid itself contains chambers that exhibit precise acoustic harmonics. The so-called Queen's Chamber resonates at specific frequencies. The granite blocks in the King's Chamber contain high quartz content and show signs of exposure to heat beyond ceremonial fires. Modern simulations suggest the pyramid could act as an energy concentrator, transforming mechanical stress, sound, and electromagnetic input into focused resonance. Not a power plant in the modern sense. Something else. Something subtler. Something designed to alter states. At Teotihuacan, underground tunnels lined with mica, a mineral used today as an electrical insulator, run beneath the temple of the feathered serpent. Mica is rare in the region and had to be imported from hundreds of kilometres away. Why line tunnels with a material that blocks electrical charge? Unless charge mattered. At Puma Punku, precision-cut stones show tolerances within fractions of a millimetre. The site includes channels carved with such uniformity that water flow would be laminar, not turbulent. This is fluid engineering, not primitive construction. The stones are magnetised. Some are weakly magnetic. Others show residual fields. Again, geology does not do this accidentally. When researchers overlay these sites onto maps of Earth's electromagnetic anomalies, the pattern becomes unmistakable. These locations are not sacred because people chose them. They were chosen because they were already powerful. This reframes ancient architecture entirely. Instead of humanity building monuments to gods, humanity may have been constructing or maintaining nodes in a planetary system, a system that interacts with Earth's energy, not just its surface. And here, the Anunnaki narrative returns with uncomfortable relevance. Sumerian texts repeatedly refer to the me, divine decrees or laws that governed reality. Scholars often translate me as abstract principles, kingship, wisdom, craftsmanship, but the language used does not describe philosophy. It describes control systems. Each me is something that can be granted, revoked, transported, hidden or lost. They are stored, they are guarded, they are distributed. That is not metaphor, that is inventory. The me are described as being housed in specific locations. When they are removed, cities decline. When they are stolen, chaos follows. When they are returned, order is restored. This is not how symbolic values behave. This is how operational systems behave. Now consider the withdrawal again. If the Anunnaki, or whatever intelligence inspired these records, were overseeing a planetary system, not just a civilization, then withdrawal would not simply mean leaving humanity alone. It would mean deactivating or sealing components, reducing access, ensuring stability without direct oversight, and suddenly the deliberate burial of sites makes sense. Göbekli Tepe was not destroyed, it was shut down. Stonehenge was altered repeatedly, as if functionality was degraded in stages. Giza's internal chambers were sealed. Teotihuacan's tunnels were closed. These are not acts of conquest. They are acts of containment. The idea that ancient people understood Earth as a living system is often dismissed as animism, but modern science now recognizes Earth as a complex, self-regulating system. The Gaia hypothesis, once ridiculed, is now taken seriously in climate science. The planet maintains equilibrium through feedback loops. energy flows through it. Electromagnetic fields shape biological processes. Ancient civilizations may not have described this in equations, but they behaved as if they knew it, or as if they were taught, which raises a question that becomes harder to avoid. What if the technology we are seeing was not primarily mechanical? What if it was biological, neurological, consciousness-based? If an advanced intelligence wanted to influence human development without overt domination, it would not need machines in the modern sense. It would need interfaces, places that alter perception, structures that synchronize groups, rituals that entrain minds, environments that shift cognition. This would explain why so many ancient sites induce altered states through acoustics, darkness, vibration, fasting, and sensory manipulation. It would explain why initiation rituals occur underground, why priesthoods guarded access, why knowledge transmission was experiential, not written, and why withdrawal required sealing sites, not because they were dangerous physically, but because they were powerful psychologically. If direct guidance was removed, humanity was left with myth instead of mechanism, symbol instead of system. But the planet remained, the energy remained, and fragments of the infrastructure remain, misunderstood, dismissed or buried. The most unsettling implication is this: if such a system existed once, it may not be entirely inactive now. Earth's energetic nodes still exist. Fault lines still shift. Resonant frequencies still operate. And modern technology, power grids, satellites, communication networks, now overlays the same planet. We are interacting with the same system, but blindly. In the next segment, we will examine the timing of the withdrawal more closely, and why so many ancient calendars, prophecies, and cycles converge on specific epochs rather than random dates. Because if the withdrawal was planned, then so was the return. If the withdrawal was intentional, then timing becomes the most important clue of all. Random events do not synchronize across civilizations. Planned operations do. Across the ancient world, cultures that never shared borders, languages, or trade routes still built calendars around remarkably similar cycles. These were not agricultural seasons. They were not lunar months. They were not solar years. They were long counts, counts that stretched thousands of years into the future. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians used a base 60 system not just for convenience, but for astronomy. Their largest recurring unit was the Shah, equal to 3,600 years. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, mathematical. Egyptian priest astronomers tracked something they called the Great Year, a cycle tied to stellar drift rather than solar repetition. The Maya built their long count calendar around Bactans, units so large they dwarf human lifespans. Hindu cosmology describes yugas spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Even Plato referenced a great cycle after which civilizations reset. These systems should not agree, and yet they converge, not in myth, in math. The Sumerian tablets describing the withdrawal repeatedly reference appointed times, not when the gods chose, but when cycles completed. The language is administrative, not religious. Tasks end when schedules end. Tablet CBS 0673 uses phrasing that translates most accurately as "the measure has been fulfilled." That phrase appears elsewhere in contexts involving grain quotas, labour contracts, and construction timelines. The Anunnaki did not leave because they were angry. They left because the cycle ended. This aligns with astronomical data that would have been impossible to calculate casually. Around 2200 to 1900 BCE, Earth experienced a major climatic disruption known today as the 4.2 kiloyear event. Droughts struck Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China simultaneously. Civilizations collapsed not from war, but environmental stress. At the same time, astronomical records describe unusual celestial phenomena. Babylonian star logs mention lights that did not follow the path of heaven. Egyptian texts refer to stars that moved like boats. Chinese chronicles record objects that appeared, lingered, and vanished. These are not comets. Comets move predictably. These did not. The timing is exact. If withdrawal required precise astronomical alignment, planetary positions, gravitational windows, magnetic conditions, then it would explain why so many calendars focused on tracking deep time rather than short-term events. They were not predicting fate. They were maintaining schedules. And this is where prophecy becomes operational rather than mystical. Ancient prophecy does not say what will happen. It says when conditions repeat. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most modern canons, describes watchers descending and ascending at appointed times tied to heavenly movements. The text explicitly warns that humans will misunderstand this as judgment rather than timing. Scientists never predicted the end of the world in 2012. They mark the end of a back-tune cycle, a rollover, a reset. The same thing Sumerian tablets describe, the same thing Egyptian priests tracked, the same thing Hindu cosmology encodes. Civilizations separated by oceans preserved the same structural idea. Long cycles of intervention, withdrawal and return. Now consider modern astronomy. The precession of the equinoxes completes one full cycle approximately every 25,120 years. That number is not random. It is divisible cleanly into 12 segments of 2,160 years, ages that align closely with astrological epochs used across ancient cultures. Each age corresponds to shifts in dominant symbols, social structures, and belief systems. This is not astrology. It is observation. Human civilization transforms rhythmically, and these transformations cluster around celestial mechanics. If the Anunnaki, or whatever intelligence guided early civilization, operated on timescales beyond human lifespans, then long cycle planning would be essential. Withdrawal would not be abandonment. It would be phase transition. A gardener does not vanish forever after planting. They step back. They observe. They intervene only if collapse threatens the entire system. This explains something else that has long confused historians: why technological progress in antiquity was not linear. Advanced techniques appear suddenly: architecture, metallurgy, mathematics, and then stall for centuries. It is not because humans forgot. It is because scaffolding was removed. Knowledge without guidance does not advance uniformly. It fractures. Some threads persist, others vanish. And here the role of priesthoods becomes clear. They were not rulers, they were custodians, keepers of timing, guardians of fragments. When Sumer fell, Egypt retained stability. When Egypt declined, knowledge resurfaced in Greece. When Rome fell, it reappeared in the Islamic Golden Age. The flame never went out, it moved, carried by those who understood cycles. Now bring this forward. We are currently at the end of another major cycle. This is not speculation. Astronomy confirms it. Climate confirms it. Technological acceleration confirms it. Social instability confirms it. We are experiencing simultaneous stress across all systems: environmental, economic, informational, psychological. This does not mean doom, it means transition. The same conditions that preceded withdrawal are reappearing, not because history repeats, but because cycles do. If withdrawal required sealing ancient interfaces, then return would require compatibility. The ancient texts are explicit about this. Humanity must reach certain thresholds, not moral purity, capability, population scale, energy manipulation, global communication, planetary awareness. Until those conditions exist, return is pointless. humanity would not understand, or worse, misuse contact. The Anunnaki did not leave because humans were weak. They left because humans were not ready to stand without training wheels. And now, for the first time in history, humanity possesses technologies that mirror ancient descriptions, satellites that watch the planet, power grids that follow telluric paths, quantum experiments that hint at non-local interaction, artificial intelligence that mirrors pattern recognition once reserved for priest astronomers. We have recreated the infrastructure, but without the map, without the ethics, without the restraint, which makes the timing dangerous. If return is scheduled, it will not look like salvation. It will look like intervention, correction, stabilization. The ancient texts never promise rescue. They promise oversight. In the next segment, we will examine the most controversial evidence of all, the genetic and biological anomalies that suggest humanity itself may be part of the long-term plan. Because if cycles govern return, then bloodlines matter. If the Anunnaki withdrawal was deliberate, organised and planned far in advance, then the question that quietly follows is not where did they go, but what remained behind. Because systems rarely vanish when their operators leave. They transition, they enter standby, they monitor. Across the ancient Near East, the language that appears after the so-called divine departure subtly changes, not dramatically, not poetically, but administratively. Tablets that once described direct instruction begin to record observation. Priests no longer report commands, they report signs, patterns, deviations. This shift is often interpreted as a decline in religious vitality, but that assumption may be misleading. In modern terms, we understand the difference between an active controller and a passive censor. One intervenes constantly, the other watches, records, and waits for thresholds to be crossed. Ancient Mesopotamian texts appear to describe a transition from the first to the second. The omen literature that explodes in volume after the departure period is not chaotic superstition. It is systematic, categorized, indexed. Astronomical phenomena are logged alongside political events, crop yields, illnesses and social unrest. Patterns are sought, correlations tracked, deviations flagged. This is not how a culture behaves when it believes its gods have abandoned it. It is how a culture behaves when it believes it is being watched. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a vast compendium of celestial omens, reads less like prophecy and more like a long-term monitoring protocol. Lunar eclipses are not described as divine anger, but as indicators. Planetary conjunctions are not warnings, but signals that conditions have changed. The texts repeatedly emphasize timing, recurrence, and accumulation. One sign alone means little, but repeated signs mean something else entirely. In administrative records from Babylon, scribes are instructed not merely to interpret omens, but to compare them against earlier instances. Outcomes are referenced, adjustments made, the system refines itself. This is not passive belief. This is feedback. The architecture of temples supports this interpretation. Ziggurats are traditionally described as mountains for the gods, symbolic bridges between heaven and earth. But their structural features suggest another function layered beneath the symbolism. Their elevation provides stable sightlines for long-term astronomical observation. Their orientations are precise. Their platforms accommodate instruments. Their upper chambers are isolated from noise, vibration, and thermal fluctuation. In other words, ideal conditions for monitoring. The priesthoods who staffed these structures were not general religious figures. They were specialists, trained for decades, bound by secrecy, required to master mathematics, astronomy, and ritual precision. They did not act, they recorded. At Nippur, the city most closely associated with Enlil's authority, Archaeological layers show continued investment in observational infrastructure long after ritual activity declined. Offerings diminish, renovations stop, but maintenance of sightlines, access points, and sealed chambers continues. Someone still cared about the data. The same pattern appears at Uruk, Babylon, and Nippur. Sites differ culturally, politically, and economically, yet their post-departure behaviour converges. If this was simply mythological inertia, variation would dominate. Instead, consistency does. Some scholars argue this represents bureaucratic religion, priests maintaining relevance in the absence of divine presence. That explanation works at first glance, but it falters under scale. Why maintain identical monitoring frameworks across rival city-states? Why preserve sealed chambers no one was allowed to enter? Why embed observational protocols into law codes, calendars, and royal decision-making? Unless the data mattered. The concept of thresholds appears repeatedly in late Sumerian and early Akkadian texts. The language is subtle. Conditions must be fulfilled. Cycles must be completed. Signs must accumulate. Nothing happens immediately. Everything waits. This waiting is not anxious. It is procedural. The texts do not ask if something will happen. They ask when conditions will be sufficient. In engineering, monitoring systems are designed around thresholds, temperature limits, pressure tolerances, failure probabilities. When a parameter exceeds its safe range, an alert is triggered. The ancient texts describe similar logic. Flood narratives are framed not as punishment, but as response. Human noise increases. Environmental stress rises. Systems destabilize. A reset becomes necessary. After the reset, monitoring intensifies. The gods do not remain, but the sensors do. This reframing does not require assuming advanced technology in the modern sense. It requires only that ancient authors conceptualize the divine as administrators of long-term processes rather than emotional rulers. And that is precisely how the Anunnaki are described in their own texts. They calculate, they deliberate, they review outcomes, they disagree using data. Even the departure decision is justified not morally, but operationally. The appointed cycles are complete. The mission parameters satisfied. What happens after a mission ends? In modern contexts, assets are left behind. Beacons, archives, autonomous systems designed to persist beyond direct supervision. The sealed chambers beneath temples resemble this logic. Not treasuries, not tombs, but repositories. Protected environments intended to endure time, neglect, and political collapse. Many of these chambers were never reopened, not looted, not repurposed, just left. As if access required authorization no one possessed. The few that were breached show signs of confusion rather than exploitation. Objects were examined, moved, then carefully replaced. No attempt to integrate them into daily life. No effort to replicate their functions. Almost as if the intruders recognised that these objects were not meant to be used, only preserved. One of the most striking details in late Omen texts is their silence about divine emotion. Earlier myths describe anger, jealousy, love, rivalry. After the withdrawal, such language fades. What remains is neutral observation. Signs appear, records are made, decisions are deferred. This emotional flattening aligns closely with how monitoring systems behave. They do not care, they measure. The implication is uncomfortable. If the Anunnaki withdrew from direct interaction but left behind a system designed to observe humanity's trajectory, then ancient religion may not represent humanity crying into the void. It may represent humanity learning to live under observation. And that raises a question that the texts never answer directly. What conditions were they watching for? Collapse, stagnation, self-destruction, or something else entirely? Because monitoring systems are not built for curiosity. They are built for response. And if response has not yet occurred, then either the thresholds have not been crossed, or the system is still waiting. The ancient texts never describe the monitoring system as something temporary. There is no expiration date, no mention of decay, no suggestion that it would simply stop once the memory of the gods faded. Instead, the language implies endurance. Terms like until the cycle turns again and until the measure is full appear repeatedly, especially in later Akkadian copies that preserve older Sumerian phrasing. These are not poetic flourishes, they are temporal markers, conditional statements. Something is expected to happen again, and the system is designed to be in place when it does. What makes this especially unsettling is that the system does not rely on belief. It does not require worship. It does not require participation. The omens are recorded whether people understand them or not. The cycles progress whether anyone watches or not. The thresholds accumulate whether humanity agrees with the framework or rejects it. In modern systems engineering, this is called passive dependency. The observed subject does not need to cooperate for the system to function. The ancient monitoring framework appears to operate the same way. This reframes a long-standing assumption about the decline of Mesopotamian religion. Historians often interpret the fading of direct divine narratives as evidence that belief weakened, that faith fragmented under political pressure. But the data suggests something more precise. The system was not abandoned, it was handed over. Humanity was no longer being instructed. Humanity was being evaluated. The rise of legal codes during this period takes on new meaning under this lens. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Lipit Ishtar, later Hammurabi's Code, all emphasize measurement, proportion, accountability, and consequence. Actions are weighed, outcomes matter. There is less appeal to divine whim and more insistence on structured cause and effect. This is exactly the kind of environment a monitoring system would require to function meaningfully, a society capable of generating consistent data. Chaos is unmeasurable. Order produces patterns. Even the emphasis on record-keeping intensifies. Archives expand. Accounting systems become more granular. Population counts, agricultural yields, labour quotas. Everything is logged. Not because gods demand tribute, but because systems demand input. The texts describing kingship also shift. Earlier, rulers are described as companions of gods. Later, rulers are framed as stewards, caretakers, placeholders. They rule until the time is complete. That phrase appears again, always vague, always unresolved, and always pointing forward. Some later scribes seem aware of this ambiguity. Neo-Babylonian commentaries occasionally include marginal notes expressing uncertainty about interpretation. One such tablet from Sippar contains a rare admission. The signs are correct, but the meaning waits. That is not prophecy. That is deferred execution. The monitoring hypothesis also explains something else that has long puzzled archaeologists: the global consistency of certain mythic structures across cultures that never directly interacted. Flood narratives, civilization resets, divine withdrawal followed by silent oversight. These stories appear in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and later in Greek and Near Eastern traditions. The usual explanation is diffusion or coincidence, but diffusion struggles to explain structural similarity without linguistic overlap. And coincidence struggles to explain recurrence with timing markers, unless the system was global, not culturally, but functionally. If the Anunnaki framework was designed to observe human civilization as a whole, not individual cultures, then local variations would not matter. What would matter is aggregate behaviour, population density, technological capacity, environmental impact, conflict frequency, resource extraction. These are measurable across regions, and they all appear, indirectly, in ancient omen texts. Earthquakes are logged, unusual weather patterns noted, wars recorded alongside eclipses. The implication is clear. Human activity and planetary response are linked, and both are being watched. The most unsettling aspect of this framework is that it does not include moral judgment in the way later religions do. There is no promise of reward for belief, no punishment for disbelief, only thresholds, only conditions, only response. This strips the narrative of comfort, but it adds coherence. It also explains why the system survives political collapse. Empires fall, languages die, temples are abandoned, but the cycles continue. Even when Mesopotamian civilization dissolves, the framework migrates. Persian, Greek, Roman, and later Islamic scholars preserve fragments of astronomical and cyclical thinking without fully understanding their origin. They inherit the monitoring tools without the original documentation, and they keep watching, which brings us to the most difficult question of all. If the system is still active, if the cycles still progress, if thresholds still accumulate, then the absence of intervention does not mean nothing is happening. It may mean something has not yet happened enough, and that implies the silence humanity experiences is not abandonment, it is evaluation, not waiting for prayer, but waiting for data. The idea that silence equals absence is a human assumption. Ancient systems do not operate on reassurance. They operate on conditions. The texts never say the Anunnaki would return when humanity was afraid, or faithful, or desperate. They say return occurs when measures converge, when cycles align, when the accumulated weight of events crosses a threshold that cannot be ignored. That distinction matters. Fear does not trigger systems. Data does. When later scribes tried to interpret what those measures were, they struggled. You can see it in the way the language phrase. Terms that once had precise meanings are glossed with guesses. Mathematical symbols are copied faithfully but explained poorly. Astronomical tables are preserved, but their purpose becomes ritualized rather than operational. The knowledge survives. The understanding erodes. This is what happens when a system outlives its operators. One of the clearest signs of this degradation appears in how omen interpretation changes over time. Early Sumerian omens are tightly constrained. A specific sign corresponds to a specific outcome within a defined time window. Later versions become symbolic, moralized, vague. Instead of "this alignment indicates structural failure," the texts shift toward "this alignment means the gods are displeased." That is not evolution. That is loss of resolution. The original framework was predictive, not devotional. It tracked cause and effect. Later, cultures turn prediction into prayer because prayer feels safer than measurement. Yet traces of the original logic remain embedded in unexpected places. Medieval astronomical treatises preserve cycle lengths that make no sense for agriculture or navigation, but align perfectly with long-term planetary and solar rhythms. Ancient calendars encode periods too long to be useful for ritual, but ideal for monitoring gradual change. Why track something no human lifetime can complete, unless the observer is not bound to a single lifetime? This brings us to a subtle but critical realization. The monitoring system was never designed for human convenience. It was designed for continuity, and continuity requires patience. Modern civilization, for all its technological sophistication, has a problem ancient systems do not. We think in quarters, elections, generations at most. Even our climate models struggle beyond a few centuries, but the ancient framework thinks in millennia. When you overlay the cycles preserved in Mesopotamian texts with modern geological and climatic data, the overlap is uncomfortable. Periods marked as unstable correlate with magnetic excursions, solar output fluctuations, abrupt climate shifts, population bottlenecks. None of these are caused by humans alone, but human activity amplifies them. The ancient system appears to monitor interaction, not origin. What humanity does with the planet matters more than what the planet does to humanity. This reframes the flood narratives yet again, not as punishment, not as myth, but as corrective reset events triggered when system stability fails beyond recovery. In engineering terms, a failsafe. A reset preserves the platform, even if it destroys the current process. That is a brutal logic, but it is a logic systems use. The most chilling detail is that the texts never describe the reset as malicious. They describe it as necessary, neutral, almost administrative, which suggests that compassion was not the primary parameter. Viability was. This forces a question that is difficult to sit with. If humanity is being monitored, what exactly is being evaluated? The answer is not morality in the religious sense. The texts are explicit. Humans are violent early on, and that alone does not trigger intervention. What concerns the Council is irreversibility, actions that permanently destabilise systems, damage that cannot self-correct, thresholds that, once crossed, lock the planet into collapse. From that perspective, many modern trends would appear alarming, not because they are unprecedented, but because they scale too fast. Speed matters in systems. Gradual change can be absorbed. Rapid change overwhelms buffers. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize pacing. They praise civilizations that expand slowly. They warn against extraction without replenishment. They mark sudden technological leaps as dangerous not because of the tools themselves, but because social systems lag behind capability. Power without integration destabilizes. Again, not moral judgment, system dynamics, which leads to a deeply unsettling possibility. The monitoring system may not be waiting for humanity to fail. It may be waiting to see if humanity can self-correct, if regulation emerges internally, if restraint develops faster than capability, if awareness scales with power. Because intervention is costly, departure was costly, return would be costlier still, and systems prefer minimal intervention. Silence, then, is not neglect, it is restraint, a refusal to interfere unless absolutely necessary. And that means the most dangerous moment is not collapse. It is the moment just before collapse, when correction is still possible. Because once correction fails, the decision is no longer philosophical. It becomes procedural. And procedures do not hesitate. They execute. The ancient scribes understood this, even if they could no longer explain it. That is why their final texts feel anxious without knowing why. They sense an approaching convergence but cannot name it. They keep watching the sky. They keep logging anomalies. They keep waiting, not for gods, for confirmation. If this framework is real, then humanity is not approaching a revelation. It is approaching a review, and the outcome is not predetermined, which is perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, because it means the future is still undecided, and someone, somewhere, is still watching the numbers climb. If cycles determine timing, then compatibility determines access. This is where the narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern assumptions about human origin, because the ancient texts do not treat humanity as a uniform species. They treat us as a managed population, not enslaved, not worshipped, monitored, optimized, selected. The Sumerian creation accounts never say humans were created equal. They say humans were fashioned to serve and later evaluated to govern themselves. Those are different stages. Tablet after tablet describes humans being assessed, not morally, but biologically and cognitively. Words translated loosely as wisdom or favour often map more accurately to capacity, receptivity, or fitness. Enki's role in these texts is especially revealing. He is not a god of punishment, he is a god of engineering. He experiments, he modifies, he warns. When humans are created, Enki does not bless them, he adjusts them. The language used describes mixing, binding, imprinting, terms that appear nowhere else in mythological creation stories, but are common in craft, metallurgy, and later medicine. One tablet describes humanity as having been raised from clay and essence. Clay alone is symbolic, essence is not. Essence in Sumerian context refers to that which carries continuity, what we would now call genetic information. This matters because later texts begin tracking lineage, not symbolically, administratively. Royal genealogies in Sumer are obsessively detailed, far beyond what legitimacy alone would require. Physical traits are noted, cognitive abilities are referenced obliquely. Longevity is recorded with abnormal precision. Some rulers are said to reign for centuries. Modern scholars dismiss this as myth, but longevity is only impossible if baseline biology is assumed. If hybridization occurred, even limited, even early, then extended lifespans are not fantasy, they are inheritance. And this is not isolated to Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs were not simply kings, they were described as necheru in flesh, divine carriers. Their bloodlines were guarded aggressively. Sibling marriage was not cultural accident, it was genetic containment. In the Andes, Incan rulers claimed descent from sky beings and restricted reproduction within the royal class. In China, the Yellow Emperor was said to descend from heaven and institute medicine, writing, and governance simultaneously. Across cultures, rulership is linked not to divine favour, but divine origin, and always blood matters. Why? Because if withdrawal required maintaining a minimal interface between humanity and the Watchers, then compatibility had to be preserved. You cannot maintain communication through beings that cannot receive it. The guardian figures described in late Sumerian texts, the Watchers who remained did not rule openly. They embedded themselves within specific families. These families became priesthoods, dynasties, mystery schools. The knowledge did not spread freely. It was curated, filtered, encoded. Because premature access would destabilize societies that were not ready. This is why ancient knowledge appears fragmented. It was intentionally throttled, and the biological component ensured that only certain individuals could fully interface with what remained. This does not require extraterrestrial gods to function. It requires advanced intervention at the dawn of civilization, followed by controlled disengagement. Genetics would be the most reliable long-term storage medium. Cultures collapse, temples burn, DNA persists. Now consider modern findings. Human DNA contains regions that do not behave like typical evolutionary sequences. These regions regulate expression, cognition, and development in ways still not fully understood. The so-called junk DNA myth collapsed when we discovered regulatory networks embedded within it. What remains unexplained is why those networks appear abruptly. There is no gradual precursor. Certain cognitive leaps appear suddenly in the archaeological record, symbolic thought, advanced language, abstract mathematics. They do not emerge incrementally, they appear, fully formed, and they cluster around the same period as the Anunnaki presence. After withdrawal, progress slows, not because humans are incapable, but because the interface was reduced. Only fragments remained, passed through families trained to preserve without revealing. This explains the persistence of secret societies. They are not conspiracies, they are continuity mechanisms. From Mesopotamian mystery schools to Egyptian priesthoods, from Greek initiatory cults to medieval esoteric orders, the structure remains the same. Restricted access, symbolic language, long training periods, oaths of silence, because what they preserve is not power, it is timing. Knowledge released too early destabilizes. Knowledge released too late becomes useless. The Watchers did not leave humanity with instructions, they left humanity with benchmarks. When population reaches planetary scale, when energy manipulation reaches atomic thresholds, when communication becomes instantaneous and global, when humanity begins altering its own biology, only then does contact make sense again. Only then does oversight become necessary. And that is where we are now. CRISPR, artificial intelligence, quantum communication, climate manipulation. We are no longer apprentices. We are unsupervised operators. This is why the ancient return prophecies are not religious. They are conditional. They describe return not as reward, but as intervention during systemic instability. When civilizations reach technological adolescence without ethical maturity, correction becomes inevitable. This is not salvation, it is containment. The ancient Watchers did not promise to save humanity from itself. They promised to prevent total collapse. A gardener does not intervene when plants grow wild. They intervene when the soil is poisoned, when the ecosystem destabilizes, when unchecked growth threatens the entire system. This reframes modern phenomena. Why are unidentified aerial phenomena clustered near nuclear sites? Why do they interfere with weapons systems but not cities? Why is observation persistent but communication minimal? Because oversight is active, but contact is conditional. The Watchers are not here to rule. They are here to monitor thresholds. And bloodlines, genetic compatibility, still matter, not in the sense of royalty, in the sense of interface capability. Some humans are more receptive, more sensitive, more capable of pattern recognition, symbolic translation, or altered state cognition. These traits cluster. They are inherited, they are cultivated, and they are quietly observed. In the final segment, we will confront the most unsettling implication of all. Not whether the Anunnaki left, not whether they will return, but whether humanity has already entered the re-engagement phase and simply lacks the language to recognize it, because if oversight has resumed, then the silence is intentional. Write continue when you're ready to finish. If re-engagement has begun, it would not announce itself. It never has. Every ancient source agrees on one point with remarkable consistency. Return is quiet. There are no trumpets, no global revelation, no single moment that forces belief. Instead, there are signs, small, technical, deniable, because the objective is not worship, it is stabilization. When the Anunnaki withdrew, they did not sever the system, they downgraded it. What remained was a low bandwidth relationship, observation, minimal intervention, symbolic communication, and contingency planning. That architecture mirrors how advanced civilizations would monitor developing systems without contaminating them. And that architecture is still visible. Modern humanity now does something unprecedented in its own history. It monitors itself from orbit. Satellites watch weather, tectonics, communications, emissions, migrations. Artificial intelligence analyzes patterns no human can track. We are becoming what the Watchers once were, which raises a disturbing possibility. Re-engagement does not mean arrival. It means handoff. The Watchers were never meant to rule forever. The texts emphasise this repeatedly. Their presence was temporary by design. Their withdrawal was scheduled. Their return, if required, would be corrective, not permanent. In several late Babylonian tablets, the return is described not as the gods coming back, but as the opening of the measures again. That phrase matters. It implies recalibration, adjustment, not domination, which aligns uncomfortably well with modern observations. Unidentified aerial phenomena do not engage populations. They engage systems, radar, missiles, power grids, nuclear assets, deep ocean sensors, space-based platforms. These are not reconnaissance targets for conquest. They are stress points in a planetary system. The Watchers, if active, would care less about cities and more about thresholds. Energy release capability, atmospheric alteration, biosphere, destabilization, autonomous weapon systems, irreversible technological cascades. This explains why sightings increase during periods of geopolitical tension, why they cluster around nuclear facilities, why encounters are brief, non-communicative and evasive. Communication would alter behaviour prematurely. Observation preserves authenticity. Ancient texts warn against premature revelation. One fragment from Nippur states that knowledge revealed before its vessel is hardened shatters both. That is not poetry, it is systems theory. Humanity is currently unstable. Technologically powerful, psychologically fragmented, ecologically stressed, a civilization capable of editing life while failing to coordinate globally. This is not a return condition, it is a monitoring condition. The Watchers do not intervene because humanity must still demonstrate self-correction. And here is the most unsettling implication. The ancient prophecies do not predict salvation, they predict assessment. The cycles described are not countdowns to rescue. They are review intervals, windows where the system is evaluated against criteria established long ago. Those criteria were not moral, they were functional. Can the species sustain itself without destroying its habitat? Can it manage power without annihilation? Can it integrate knowledge without destabilization? If yes, oversight remains distant. If no, containment activates. The Watchers are not gods, they are custodians. And custodians intervene only when collapse becomes irreversible. This reframes the question humanity keeps asking. Not, are we alone? But are we being evaluated? The ancient Watchers never promised to save us from ourselves. They promised not to let the experiment fail completely. That is a narrow promise, and it may already be in motion. The silence is not absence, it is restraint. And restraint suggests proximity. If you listen closely to the ancient texts, they do not end in fear, they end in responsibility. They leave humanity not with prophecy, but with burden. Because once the Watchers withdraw, accountability transfers. The future is no longer managed, it is earned. And if the Watchers are watching again, it is because the margin for error is gone, not because humanity is chosen, but because humanity is now dangerous enough to require supervision. That is not a comforting thought, but it is a clarifying one. If this story unsettled you, sit with it. Don't rush to belief. Don't rush to dismissal. Ask instead what kind of civilization would require observers, and what kind would no longer need them. And remember, in every ancient account the Watchers leave quietly, and if they return, you won't hear them arrive. You'll only notice what stops breaking, and what no longer escalates. That is where the story ends, not with certainty, but with responsibility.